Hello and welcome back. Big stretch. My name is Sean and today we are diving back into The Beginning After the End, book 8.5, a novella called Amongst the Fallen. So I had a bit of a debate whether or not I should do book 8.5 or book 9. It seems like if you read this novella you might get some light spoilers for the next book, but don't read it, then you're missing some context for some scenes that will allegedly happen in book 9. So having the fact that I am moving in one day, I'm trying to crank out as much content as possible. So when I saw like, hey, I could read this in my literal day, or I could spend, a few days trying to get all my notes together and read the next entry in the series, I went with expedience. But overall, I thought this was actually a pretty nice, fun jaunt into the series. Definitely taking a step back from some things, and I think showcasing some of the skills that Turtle Me has developed. And overall, I'm fairly positive about this. But just as a warning, I am going to get into some spoilers talking about what's happening, characters involved. We are in 8.5, so at this point, you should just expect me to do nothing but talk about spoilers with these books. So in Amongst the Fallen, we are actually taking a break for the first time from Arthur, and instead going back to Dicathen to follow some of the old side characters that I honestly thought we had left behind a while ago. Actually, one of my main criticisms of like book 3 and 4 or 5 was just how many side characters were introduced that I thought we were never going to revisit, especially some more key ones that we spent longer on, and I was pleasantly surprised that we actually revisited them. We revisit Lilia Hestia, Jasmine Flamesworth, Emily and Gidean, and we go back into some of the lances, mainly focusing on like Micah and Aya. And in this book, we finally get to go see what the actual damage was from them essentially losing the war against the Alacrians. In book 8, we had Arthur get transported into Alacria, and we are focusing on him. We spent a lot of times actually humanizing the Alacrians and showing their culture and off, but the main thing that wasn't really focused on was that with the death of Arthur and him not being in that land anymore, that they essentially had lost the war. And we got a little bit at the tail end of book 7, just because that's when they try to make a final rescue and stuff, but we are stuck with the survivors, so we don't actually get to see what happened with most of Dicathen until this book, and it is not great. But like I said, my overall feelings of this were pretty positive. I like the fact that we weren't just putting it aside as a note, but we actually start to explore like what happens when someone gets conquered. But I like the juxtaposition of how we handled the last book. We were exploring Alacria, showing off the culture, showing that while they have been misled by the Victra, over and all, they're not like evil people. And then just going into this book where we get to see the conquerors, the people who are on the front lines of war, and the ones that are actually in control of Dicathen now. It's like, well, yeah, there are some still bad eggs in that society. They're not mouth-frothingly evil as a whole, but still, when you get into any type of occupation, there are going to be some bad times that happen with it. And being the losers of that and exploring it, I thought was a pretty good choice. Same thing with having Arthur just disappear, where you get to see that fallout of just having him just completely pulled out from the equation and seeing that loss of hope that happens with the country. We dived a little bit into it through Tessia and his sister's perspective and parts of the last book, but seeing how it affects people as a whole, how he's kind of whispered and sort of legend around people and just constantly using as this like giant shadowy benchmark, I thought all was pretty well done. And just how messy war is. You do have the resistance fighters, you have the people that are fighting tooth and nail against Alacria, but the vast majority of people in this is outside of fictional universes as well, just want to live their life. So just seeing that tension that's built up between people who just literally want to live their life. They're not warriors, they're not soldiers, they're just trying to like eke by and just stay alive, and how that can cause a lot of friction with people who are trying to do the right thing and fight against the occupants. When you have a bar owner that just wants to sell beers and just live his life and not die and not be drawn into some greater conflict that he is very much underprepared for and does not have the power to influence in the slightest, it's interesting just to view that perspective. And I think that's something that gets neglected in a lot of progression fantasies and any type of isekais like this. Like when you have overpowered characters that are basically demi-human gods with that level of power, going back to people who have such little control over that universe, where when they're not magical, they aren't exceptional, they're just literal business owners trying to live. It's always cool just to see that perspective and just what it would be like to live in that type of situation. But this was a pretty short book. I think my favorite part of this entire thing was when Gideon went John Wick and made a Glock and just wound up, shooting, and just his whole arc in general, I think, was one of my favorites. Jasmine flamesworth being the second. But actually, when I was starting to look and see what other people's reaction to this was and dipping my toes into the TBATE community, I did find this gem, and I will link that down below if you want to actually read it more. It's definitely worth the read. But I do like that we're finally taking that technology that was introduced and starting to expand it out more. One thing that I wish we could have explored more is early on in the war when this was started, Arthur did have that knowledge of just how much more advanced technology could have been. I thought that was a bit of a missed opportunity. It would have been cool to see him not only try to level up magically and figure out how to fight the Scythe and Retainer, but use that futuristic knowledge that he does have to really advance the war effort. I mean, yes, he can get stronger and do everything single-handedly, but how different would the war have been if everyone was equipped with AK-47s, gunpowder, and airplanes? We're talking about how to stop the ships, but he lived in a world where there probably was airplanes, guns, and fighter jets, and I think that could probably have changed the output. Now that's meta seriesing, and there's a progression fantasy specifically about his power. It would have been an interesting choice. I don't know how well it played out, but seeing us actually explore it with Gideon and with his pretty much introduction of cannons and gunpowder, I thought was a pretty cool twist. Jasmine flamesworth, I think, was one of my favorite non-Arthur directly related side characters, and that we currently have some of my favorites, like Arthur and his new companions in Alacria. I definitely think they're up on the top tier of what I actually enjoy as characters, but Jasmine flamesworth I think was one of the more fleshed out characters, along with variants since the very beginning of this series. And so diving back into her and expanding her character out, I thought in book 6 or 7, when we actually have the confrontation with her father, that we lost a bit of an opportunity to have her thoughts on the matter, and we didn't quite zoom into how she felt about that whole thing. So diving back into her character, showing the repercussions of her father and just getting into her head, I thought was a really cool choice. I've always liked her as a character, so getting more of that I thought was a very good choice. It's me from the future. So I completely forgot to mention the whole Micah Lance Aya arc, and probably my least favorite in this book so far. It's a small book, a lot of things were happening. For it being a novella, getting into 4 completely separate arcs, I think was a bit ambitious. Nice little reprieve, I enjoyed it overall, but for their arc, the only thing that really stood out for me was Micah making a black hole, which I thought was really cool. But overall, you just kind of see them in the back doing stuff. But I generally didn't find it the most exciting. I was much more interested in Gideon's Glock and getting more into Jasmine flamesworth, but nothing negative to say about it. It just, in the whole thing, so many things were happening. That was just the one that stood out the least to me. Anyway, back to you, Sean. And lastly, I don't know the exact timeline of this, but the little kind of hints that Tessia was leading the refugees. If we're going directly following the sequences of the last book, then we know that probably not going to be great for them, but I like that we had that little hint and tie-in from there. It'd be interesting to know the exact timeline if that was happening during or before the last book, and how it's just her actually just doing what she was doing, or if they are taking it at a sinister level, or we know there's probably a big trap ahead. I don't know. I'll have to read book 9 and let you guys know. But all in all, I thought this was pretty well done. It's 4 hours an audiobook. It was a pretty quick read. And I like taking a step back from Arthur, diving into some of the side characters that got introduced a while ago, going back to some characters that we haven't seen since book 4, and just really picking up some plot threads that we had dropped a while ago. Thought it was cool and overall just pretty enjoyable. Once again, this makes me pretty excited to see what will happen in the future with the new series, regardless of whether or not that's set in Alacria and Dicathen or not. I think that if we see Turtle Me make something new, either with a new cast of characters or a completely new universe at all, seeing how we can handle these new characters and having fleshed out and different viewpoints that isn't just surrounding one character and having the entire universe just spin around him, I think that in the future it would be pretty cool to see what he can do. Seeing more and more examples of him handling more characters more delicately and having a stronger writing voice and stronger character voices in general just makes me excited for the future. And the next book is book 9, and then book 10 should come out sometimes this year. We are coming to the end where we're actually going to see what that happens soon. And hopefully he continues with this. I have enjoyed this as a whole so far, so getting to see what happens next, I'm very excited about. And I've mentioned this in some comments I've written, but once we get through the next book and book 10, I am planning on picking up the manhwa and reading as much of that as I can. I want to do a bit of a comparison between the two and just talk about the differences of the different mediums. I have heard repeatedly that one of the best ways to take in the series is to read the manhwa up to like 4 and then switch to the light novel book 5. But it'll be interesting to explore, and once I have all that done, I'll do a big wrap-up video about like what I think about this series. Unfortunately, I picked this up very early into like my booktubing journey, so the quality of the camera, how awkwardly I can talk to a camera with no real audience reaction, all of it was much worse than it is now, and I'm sure in the future this video will be exactly the same. But looking back, I would have done a few of those videos very differently just with what I have picked up in the last like year of doing this. So hopefully with that long wrap-up video, I'll make it a bigger one and I can start bringing a bit more skill to it. But until then, you could expect that in the next like couple months. But as always, I appreciate you guys stopping by, and take it easy.